Now let's offer a word of prayer to the Lord, and let's dive into His Word and see what He has for us. Father, I thank you and praise you for your faithfulness, for your goodness, the fact that your sovereign and loving and gracious hand is at work in our lives. And I pray that we might see you as you are, and that might motivate us to hope and to positive, obedient action. We ask this in Jesus' blessed name. Amen. I was just thinking about my involvements in life, the way God mysteriously works, sovereignly works in ways that are just sometimes just surprising. And you've got stories like that too if you've walked with the Lord, where maybe the way you've met your spouse, maybe the way He led you into your career. Yeah, the things that He knits together are just amazing. I was thinking about how I got involved in the organization I'm with now with Interim Ministry. I spent a period of time after a lengthy pastorate where I was painting for a job. I needed a little bit of a break from pastoral ministry at that point, and I remember I got a phone call from a man that for the life of me, I can't even remember. I don't even know who he was. He called, and it was a kind of a strange conversation. He talked about his church and whatever, and I don't know if he was trying to ask me something, but anyway, the upshot of the conversation was, you need to call Rich McCarroll. Many of you know Rich, and and it sounded to me like Rich wanted me to call him and for something regarding this guy's church, and I was really confused what he was trying to say to me, but I thought, okay, well, I'll call Rich. So anyway, I hung up the phone, and I called Rich on the phone and said hi, and I knew Rich somewhat, but not real close, but he said, hi, how are you doing, Mike? Great, we chatted a while, and finally there was a silence on the phone, and Rich said, well, why did you call? And I said, well, you wanted me to call. And he was silent. He said, I wanted you to call? I said, that's what I was told. I just got a phone call. Somebody wanted me to call you. And he said, no, I really didn't. And well, it's been nice talking with you. And then we chatted just a little bit longer, and he said, well, why don't we get together and we can catch up a little bit more? Let's get together for lunch. And so we did. I found out that he was working with an organization that supplies interim pastors for churches, and as he's talked about it, I thought, that sounds like something that could be a fit for me. And so anyway, we began talking about how maybe I could get involved with that, and then he gives me a call not too long after that and said, there's a church right in the area that really needs an interim pastor soon, and he said, I think you're the guy for that, and it seemed to fit really well. And so now I've been serving in various ways, but I'm thinking, what a strange way to get into that. And even coming here, the church where I was serving, I'd been there for a little over 2 years, and they were struggling to find a pastor. And all of a sudden, the Lord provided one. And they had a congregational vote. I took my family up to the Upper Peninsula for a week, and we spent some time up there as a family. And I got news back from the church that they'd had a vote. They'd called the man to be their pastor. And I said, well, great, wonderful, And then 2 days later, I get a phone call from Rich McCarroll. And he said, I just heard by the grapevine that your church found an interim pastor. I just got a call from Jack McIntyre, and Grandville Bible Church needs a pastor, and I can't believe the timing of all this stuff. And stuff like that, you're thinking, okay, there's some fingerprints. I think God's at work. So anyway, God is an active, sovereign God. Now, I've got a visual, and there's enough stuff up here on the platform. I don't know where I can put it to where you can see it, but anyway, I'll put it over here, maybe like this. Dice, all right? Do you like games, to playing games? And you have a roll of the dice, and whatever comes up, you think of dice, you think of chance, you think of a happenstance, coincidences. Our God is sovereign. Can He influence dice to accomplish His purpose? He certainly can. He is a remarkable sovereign God who acts in ways that we can't imagine. And He's gracious. He is gracious. He acts in the lives of His people, His undeserving people, like you and like me. We're going to look at the book of Esther the next 2 weeks. And so I'd invite you to turn in the Old Testament book of Esther. And this is one of those stories that once you get started in it, you can't really stop reading it. It is really good. And obviously, I can't read the whole book and teach it to you at the same time unless we went quite slowly. And what I want to do is get the bird's eye view, get the large picture of it. And so I would encourage you to read this book of Esther once, twice, 3, 4 times, daily, whatever, during these next 2 weeks to really get it in your mind, because it is a marvelous book. And it's an interesting book because it never mentions God by name. Never uses the word God. He's just not mentioned directly. And yet he's everywhere. As you read the book of Esther, God is probably the chief character in the story. And yet he's never mentioned. But you see his hands everywhere. Now, a little bit of the background of the book of Esther, just so we can get our minds around it. The Old Testament sometimes can be just such a big book, it's kind of confusing, and you open it up and you're right in the middle of something, and I don't know how this fits. Here's how it fits into Old Testament history. This is a little timeline starting. The nation of Israel was one united kingdom under Saul, then David, then Solomon, and then it split in the year 931. And then as time went on, the northern kingdom took the name Israel. Its capital was up north in the city of Samaria. The southern kingdom was called Judah. Its capital remained Jerusalem, and the descendants of David were on the throne in Judah. Now Israel was taken captive in 722 BC by the Assyrians, and they were taken off into captivity and destroyed. But Judah continued for a while until the year 586 BC. And at that point, the Babylonians took them captive and took a good majority of the Jewish people as prisoners of war back to Babylon, which is in modern-day Iraq. And so that is where the majority of the Jews were at this point. And as time went on, a number of years passed, and then Persia became the new world empire. They took the place of Babylon. They conquered Babylon. And in the first year of Persia's reign, they had a king named Cyrus. And he decided, very much differently than the Babylonians, I think it would help my kingdom if I allowed people to go back and to observe their own national gods and their religions. So he allowed the people of Israel to go back and rebuild the temple of all things. And so they came back, and there were 3 returns, but you notice the arrows that I have coming back to Jerusalem are skinny, because there weren't very many people who went back. Many of the Jews had found comfortable lives up in that Persian area. Why go back to a land that's just destroyed and desolate? I've got a job here, I've got a business here, and so many of the Jews stayed in Persia. The first return was in 538 BC, and so there's a history in Jerusalem that we read about. That's in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, but there's also a history of the Jewish people going on in Persia. The capital of Persia, if we look at a map, Esther, the book of Esther happens right in this situation right here, the year 483, and those years surrounding that time. So Esther in the year 483. So that's a basic overview of how we fit into the Old Testament history. So we're dealing with the Jewish people, but not even in the homeland of the Jews, not even in Palestine or Israel or whatever you want to call it. We're out in Persia. Now let's look at a map. As you look here, I'll point at this one over here. You see the size of the Persian Empire. It was massive. It was huge. The whole known world, all the way from the far eastern side of what is now Iran, all the way, or Pakistan, actually, all the way to Egypt in the west. And right in the middle, you've got a city called Susa. You probably can't read it because it's mighty small writing, but Susa was the capital, and that is where Esther lived. So that gives you a little bit of an awareness of what we're talking about. And the question here is that Israel has had a lot of problems. As you look at the history of Israel at this point, she had a God who gave her incredible promises, marvelous promises. And in the heart of his promise, he chose her among all the nations of the world to be his instrument of salvation blessing. He promised that to Abraham, Genesis chapter 12. I'll make you great. I'll make your name great. I'll bless your seed. I'll make you into a great nation, a great people in the promised land. And through you all nations will be blessed. Israel is the channel of God's salvation blessing. Ultimately, Jesus Christ would come from Israel, right? So she's his instrument of blessing. But she had a covenant. In the covenant, stipulations with God basically said this: if you obey me, and if you walk with me and obey my commands, you'll be blessed. I'll set you above all the nations of the earth. But if you disobey, you'll be cursed, and you're going to be conquered, and you're going to be poor, and your crops aren't going to grow, and your military is going to be weak, and you're going to be taken captives to other nations. And that's exactly what the story of Israel's history was up to this point. So we've got a people who have been disobedient, undeserving, and now when they get a chance to go back to the promised land, they don't go. So many of them, a few did, but many of them didn't. And the question is God still going to be faithful to his people? Is he? Is he gracious? Is he going to keep his promises? Is he still active in the lives of his people? And that's a question not just for the Old Testament Israelites in Persia. That's a question for every one of us now too. Because frankly, God's church isn't so great either many times. Many times God's people fail and flounder and disobey and divide and have all of these issues. Is God still faithful? Is he still working? Are his hands at work in his church? Is there a purpose? Is there a hope? Is there a future? And the answer we see is yes. And that is what the book of Esther is showing us. So let's jump in. What we're going to do, Lord willing, is to go through the first 4 chapters. And we'll stop at that point. And then, Lord willing, next week we'll conclude the book of Esther. Plans are always subject to revision, but that's the plan right now. The first part of the book of Esther, big news, the queen gets dumped. She gets deposed. And that's where this book basically starts. Now look at where it starts. Verse 1. Now in the days of Ahasuerus. That's a lovely name, right? Ahasuerus. He was the great king. He had another name, Xerxes. You might know that name better. Xerxes the first. He ruled for 12 years, 486 down to 475, I think. But anyway, great king, and his empire, I showed you, stretched all the way from India to Kush, Pakistan to Egypt. He reigned from his throne in Susa, it says, and I showed you about where that is on the map. It says the citadel. Okay, that's the fortified city where foreign invaders couldn't get in there because it was fortified and protected. It's modern Iran, where his kingdom was. According to the ancient historian Herodotus, he was one of the 3 greatest Persian kings, along with his father and with his son. And that historian said he was the tallest, the most handsome king, ambitious, and also, frankly, ruthless. He was a brilliant warrior and a jealous lover. So all of these characteristics of King Ahasuerus, King Xerxes. Well, in his 3rd year, we're told that he gave a great feast. And I'm just going to summarize now. I'm not going to keep reading that at this point. We'll read some sections. But in his 3rd year, he gives a great feast. So now we're down to 483 BC. And he invites officials from all over his empire. So people are traveling hundreds, if not thousands of miles to Susa, to his palace, to be part of this huge feast. And Xerxes, according to his character, he's trying to show off his pomp. He's showing his greatness and his power and his majesty. For 180 days, he's dazzling these international guests. And that huge event concludes with a 7-day feast. And they feast, and they do it well. They're in a beautiful enclosed garden where they've got a mosaic floor, couches that are decorated with gold and silver. Wine is being served in golden goblets in unlimited quantities. And on the 7th day, Xerxes thinks to himself, what can I do to end this feast with a bang? What can I do to top it all off in an unforgettable way? And he's thinking to himself, I've got it. My greatest treasure, my queen, Vashti, the most beautiful woman on the planet. I'm going to have her come in wearing her crown, dazzling all of these male guests that are here. And they can ooh and ah. I'm the king who has everything. And so he issues orders, command, Vashti, you come, display your beauty to all of these men. Well, Vashti basically says, go take a jump in a lake. I'm not doing it. You just want me to be a show thing? Forget it. Now, Xerxes is a proud man, and now she has embarrassed him in front of all of the royal officials. I mean, he can't just let that go, can he? And so he calls in his advisors, and he says, what should I do to her? I mean, he is spitting mad. And one official, speaking with all of his wise Persian wisdom, says, she has not done only wrong against you, O king, but she has done wrong against all the nobles of your kingdom, and she has done wrong against every man who has a wife in the whole kingdom. Women all over the empire are now going to hear about this. They're all going to revolt against their husbands. So make a decree. And you know the decrees of the Persians, the Medes and the Persians can never be repealed, right? Make a decree against her, remove her from her position as queen, teach her a lesson, give her royal position to somebody else, somebody who's more deserving. Then women all over your kingdom will respect their husbands, and they will honor their husbands. I mean, can't you just hear it? So they send out the decree in writing throughout the entire kingdom, proclaiming in every language that men should be the rulers over their own households. And all the men said, amen. No, just kidding. So that's how it starts. So what happens now? Well, in chapter 2, we're told that sometime later, after King Ahasuerus cools down, he thinks back to his queen and thinks, I don't have a queen right now. And he thinks, we need to follow up on that decree and find a replacement for Queen Vashti. And so he asks his attendants again, and they say, well, we've got an idea. Let a search be made. We've got an idea. Have a beauty contest. That's how. Send out your officials to round up the most beautiful young virgins in the entire empire. Give them a year of royal beauty treatments, and then have them each spend a night with a king. And after that, each girl will go out to a harem to live out as part of your concubine, and you can call a girl back if you want to, and the one that pleases you, presto, she's the queen. You say, ooh, that doesn't sound so good. No. But when you're living in a pagan empire, what do you expect? That's life in a pagan empire. Now we're introduced to two Jews at this point. If you look down at chapter 2, verse 5, there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, so they're right there in that fortified capital city, and his name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, and it goes through his line a little bit there. His family had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives who were carried away with Jeconiah, the king of Judah, in 586, as I showed you on that chart, with the Babylonians. So this is the first key figure, Mordecai. Now, Mordecai also has another name, his Persian name. Well, actually, most Jews had two names. They had a Hebrew name and a Persian name. His Persian name is the one that's given. Mordecai is related to the name Marduk, which was a god. All right? This is a pagan god, Marduk. You can almost hear it, Marduk, Mordecai. He's given this pagan name. He's raising a cousin who also had two names. Her name was Hadassah, was her Hebrew name, but she also had a Persian name, Esther, and that's related to the name Ashtar, which is Ishtar, which is another pagan god. But she's known from here on by the name of Esther. And it says that the young woman had a beautiful figure. She was lovely to look at. And when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So she's a cousin or a daughter of an uncle or something, but a little bit of an extended relative. He takes her, basically adopts her, and becomes a father figure to her. And she is drop dead gorgeous. Well, the edict goes out. The young virgins are gathered, and they probably had no say in the matter. They're just gathered and brought to the king's palace for these beauty treatments in preparation to be presented to the king. And it says that she quickly won the favor of the man in charge of the entire harem. God's hand seems to be on her, doesn't it? She wins favor. Amazing. And he gives her 7 maids, which means just a plethora of people to work for her and to help her. He moved her into the best place in the entire harem. But we're told in verse 10, if you look down at verse 10, Esther had not made known her people or her kindred. For Mordecai, her adopted father, had commanded her, do not make it known. Tell nobody that you're a Jew. Nobody. Keep that part quiet. And you wonder why. Was he trying to give her a better chance at winning this thing? Maybe. Was there fear of anti-Semitism? Anti-Semitism, prejudice against Jewish people. It seems that it's all down through history that's been an issue. And it's flourishing right now again. I believe there's satanic motivation because God hates the people of Israel because he knows she is his chosen instrument. One of his chosen instruments. The church is the other one. That's you and me. And he doesn't like us either, quite frankly. But he says, don't tell anybody that you're a Jew. And Mordecai checked on her every day. It says in verse 11, he walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her every single day. Well, Esther's being prepared. 12-month process to see the king. Special food, special cosmetics, spices, ointments. Maybe they had a health club. I don't know. Maybe she was doing bench presses and everything else. I don't know. But the women would go then, after all of this preparation, and spend a night with the king. And then they would return to the harem in the morning. They would not see the king again unless he requested she come back. And she would then live the rest of her days, whichever of these virgins that came into him, in a royal harem because they were no longer a virgin. And the king would provide for her, and they'd be basically part of his harem. You say, that just sounds awful. It's life in a pagan empire. They had no choice. Well, Esther goes into the king in his 7th year. That would have been December 479. She wins his favor. And look at what happens. Verse 17. The king loved Esther more than all of the women. She won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set his royal crown on her head and made her the queen instead of Vashti. And then the king gave a great feast for all his officials and servants to celebrate, basically, the fact that Esther is now the new queen. And he throws this huge feast for her. Now, as you look at this story up to this point, it raises some, should I say, disturbing questions about Esther. I mean, first, was Esther committed to keeping the law of Moses? That, for any observant Jew, that would be one of the first questions. How could she possibly keep her Jewishness a secret? Especially if she did things like keep Sabbath day? I mean, wouldn't that be totally obvious? If she ate kosher food only, wouldn't that be totally obvious that she's a Jew? So is she compromising? And then you look at this and you begin to think, what are we to think of Esther morally? Well, she probably had no choice in the matter. But what did she think of this whole process? Spending a night with a king? Well, we don't know. We don't know the details. We do know this. God works in a very imperfect world, right? We don't live in a utopia. We live in a world where there's so much wrong. And yet somehow in that world, our world, God works for his glory. And he works things together for good for those who love him. Well, sometime later, there's a curious little event that happens, which it's another thing that's kind of like a roll of the dice. I don't know. I mean, it's one of those things when it happened, it just made people kind of scratch their heads. But Mordecai, her adoptive father, is sitting at the king's gate. This is a large fortified gate in front of the palace. And it means that Mordecai had a respectable position. If you know anything about the Jewish people, many of them. Somebody said one of the reasons they're an often hated minority is that they are a minority that often is successful. And they thrive. And a thriving minority is sometimes hated. Well, Jews often can find ways to get positions on Wall Street, great positions in Hollywood, wherever. I mean, they seem to rise to the upper levels. He is at the king's gate. It means he's a respectable person in a respectable position. We don't know. Maybe Esther had something to help him with that as well. We don't know. But when you think of the city gate, we tend to think of a city gate as a place where homeless people are going to hang out. But in the ancient world, you know who hung out at the city gates? That was basically like City Hall. That's where the business transactions, that was the commercial and legal center of the city. So he's in City Hall, basically, sitting at the gate. So when you read that, that's what that means. And somehow, while Mordecai is at this gate interacting with all of these professional business people, he overhears something. A couple of the king's officials have got an assassination plot that they're working on to kill the king. And so Mordecai alerts Esther. Why? Maybe he's concerned if the king's going to be killed, maybe she will be too. But he tells Esther. Esther then goes to the king and informs him. And she gives the credit. And then she names Mordecai. She doesn't mention anything about the relationship they have. Just this man named Mordecai is the one who gave us the word. But she keeps her family background, her Jewishness, still a total secret. And so the king sets forth people to investigate. They find that it's true. These guys are going to kill him. And so the two individuals are arrested. They are executed. They are hung on gallows. Now, if you don't know what gallows are, it's not probably a rope that they're hung on. It's impaled. That's what the Persians often did. You say, yuck. Yeah, yuck is right. But again, you're in a pagan empire where things are done sometimes in a very cruel way. The event was recorded right in the official records. It was written down. And you think, surely Mordecai is going to get a great reward for this. And guess what happens? Nothing. Somehow, the way governments are, people overlook things all the time, and they just forgot this, and it just kind of got swept right under the rug. Nobody even remembered Mordecai. Nothing was done. Okay, well, where are you, God? Guess he's not there, right? So, Mordecai gets no reward. Ironically, somebody else winds up getting promoted shortly after, a man named Haman. Now, when the Jews read the book of Esther at the Feast of Purim, whenever they say the name Haman, they hiss. They ring bells or whatever. This is the villain. This is the bad guy, right? Haman. He's an evil man. And he gets promoted. So, chapter 3, verse 1, I'll just read the first line. After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the Agagite. That's a pretty good name for him. Sounds like gagging, right? Haman, the Agagite. Now, Haman is a bad person. The Agagites may not mean a lot to you, but their granddaddy was Agag, the king of the Amalekites during the time of Samuel. And they were a historic enemy of people. He led an attack on Israel as she was peacefully journeying through as they came out of Egypt. And so this man, descendant of a historic enemy of the Jews, is advanced to a high position. Not just high, but the latter part of verse 1, the king set his throne above all the officials who were with him. So he's over everybody else except for the king, second in command. We might think of him like a prime minister. And this king commands, the king Xerxes commands people, honor Haman by bowing to him when he comes by. You bow to him out of respect. Well, one person doesn't. So Haman, as he walks out through the gate, here's Mordecai sitting here and everybody else bows to him. Mordecai just sits here with his arms folded, does nothing. Haman looks at him, pardon me, aren't you going to do something? Aren't you going to bow? And he just stands there looking at him. Wow, this goes over really well, it just starts to grind on him. He hates this. And it goes on day after day. Was this due to religious conviction? The Jews believe that you don't worship other gods. Well, it could have been, but there's nothing in the text to suggest that. You get the idea that it's more, this bowing was probably just an act of respect anyway, not an act of worship. And it's like bowing to the queen, And godly Jews like Nehemiah, they showed respect. Nehemiah would say things like, "Long live the king, may the king live forever." And Daniel, to Nebuchadnezzar, he calls him my Lord, and he says, "Live forever, O king." So it's acceptable for Jews to show real respect. It looks like Mordecai just doesn't want to give that kind of respect to a man like Haman. The king's servants tell Haman, they come later, and they inform him it's because he's a Jew. Because Haman, or Mordecai told them about his ethnic identity. And so they said it's because he's a Jew. That's why he's not going to do it. He's a Jew. And Haman hadn't really noticed Mordecai up until these episodes. Now that he's been told Mordecai is the only one that he can even see. When he goes out the gate, his eyes are looking for Mordecai. There he is. He's not bowing again. And he's just getting more and more agitated at what he sees. And he decides, finally, I've got to do something. And in his rage, he concludes, it's not enough just to kill Mordecai. I'm going to kill all of his people. I'm second in the kingdom. Let's just kill them all. Let's just rid the world of Jews. It'll be a better place then. That's what he's thinking. Wipe out the Jewish race, genocide, the final solution, whatever word you want to put on it. They cast lots then to determine the best time for this slaughter to take place. So he's sitting down with his advisors, and they go to their lots. Now, in the Hebrew Bible, there are several words for lots, but one of them is pur. And it's where we get the word Purim, which is the feast the Jews observe when they're remembering the events of the book of Esther. And the pur looked, at least some of the pictures I've seen, look a lot like dice. And you know, you can roll the dice and see how it turns out. And it seems that somehow, we don't know exactly how it worked, but sometimes it was stones that were colored different ways. Sometimes it was pieces of wood. But somehow they would shake it and throw it because terms like that are used. And somehow it rendered a verdict, a yes or no verdict. And they were able to eliminate maybe people or other categories or other dates or whatever and zero in on one. And as they threw these dice, and it was seen as a divination before the gods to see what the gods would decide is the best time to do this. And so they're looking up to their gods, guide us with our pur as we cast these dice to decide the time. Give us the best time. Well, guess what God is working in the dice? It fell, which of the next 12 months? It fell in the 12th month. It gave an entire year in which God could work his perfect plan out. So, God is working even in the roll of dice of an evil, evil man who did it looking at his own gods. Well, as they cast these dice, they arrive on the 12th month, and Haman... the 12th month, which is called the month of Adar, meaning he's going to have to wait almost a year. So he's going to have to go through this for another year. But so be it. Haman then goes to see the king, and he's a manipulator. Oh, he's a master manipulator. Look at the way he talks to the king. Basically what he says, he comes to the king, "Oh, king, live forever." And he says, "There is a certain dispersed people who don't obey your laws." That's a bad thing, isn't it, O king? It's not in your best interest to let these people live, O king. So make a decree to destroy them. Well, he's a trusted advisor. I mean, what's the king going to do? But listen. And then Haman says, "I'll finance the project with 10,000 talents, which is an incredible amount of money." And the king agrees. He gives him his signet ring, which has the authority of the king himself. You've got a full authority in this matter. And the decree is sent out all over Persia. And the photo you can see up here is a tablet. That's Persian writing. That's the way they wrote back then. And if it was done on a clay tablet, which it could have well been, it could have been dispersed in a form that looked very much like that. It was probably also written down on pieces of paper or papyrus as well and distributed. And it calls for the Persians to take up arms against their Jewish neighbors and to kill them all, young and old, on the appointed day, which is 12 months away. When the news goes out all over the land, the whole city of Susa is shaken by this. The king they're shaken. The Jews are just terrified and shocked and stunned. But the king and Haman, what do? They sit down to enjoy some drinks together and have fun and celebrate. The people have no voice. This is not a democracy. There's no vote. People have no say in the matter. Such is life in a pagan kingdom. So, as the decree goes out throughout the empire, the Jews are mourning and wailing. We're told that when Mordecai, chapter 4, verse 1, when he learns all that has been done, he tears his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes. Here's a sculpture. It's in Israel, but it's of a man tearing his clothes in mourning and in grief. And so it gives you an idea of what it may have looked like. As Mordecai is just tearing his clothes, going through the very actions of grief, putting ashes on his head, wailing loudly. And he does this right outside the king's gate. He's making this huge scene of grief. Well, the news comes inside the palace, reaches Esther. She sends one of her servants. Go to Mordecai, find out what's going on, because she's been living in the palace. She doesn't know anything that's going on out there. Mordecai gives all the details. He gives a handwritten copy of the verdict, of the edict. And he says, go right into the king's presence. Beg his favor. Plead with him on behalf of your people, Esther. And she replies to him, all of the king's officials know that if a man or a woman approaches the king without being summoned, he or she must be put to death. That's life, right? In an empire. They must be put to death unless the king holds out his golden scepter to spare that person's life. So I'm taking my life in my hands if I go unannounced to meet with him. And she says, the king has not summoned me for 30 days. Mordecai then gives the powerful words, the key words of the book. Look, chapter 4, verse 12. 4:12. And they told Mordecai what Esther had said. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to this kingdom for such a time as this. What's underneath all of this? Providence, a sovereign God. Esther hears these words, who knows but that you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? And she tells this reply back to Mordecai, go gather all of the Jews to be found in Susa, everybody in this whole town. Now, Jews were scattered all throughout the kingdom, all throughout the empire, but there were a number of them in Susa. Gather all the Jews in this town and have them hold a fast on my behalf. This book doesn't mention God, it doesn't mention prayer, but what do you do when you fast? Generally, you pray, right? Have them fasting for me, praying for me, thinking of me. And do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast, just as you do. And then I will go to the king, though it's against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Mordecai then went away, and he did everything as Esther had ordered him. Things have flip-flopped now. And from this point in the book, Esther now is not going to Mordecai for advice. She's taking initiative, wise initiative, on her own. Now, we're going to stop at this point. This story does have a good ending, but we will stop at mid-story. It's partly, as I said already, because I don't want to rush through it too fast, but it's also because this is the point where we live our lives, right? We live in the middle of the story. When does this story, God's story, end? It's when Christ comes back. It's when he makes everything right, when he judges evil, when he blesses those who are faithful to him. The story's not done, and we're in the middle of it. And a lot of it looks very unfinished and very much up in the air. On one side, we've got a lot of dangers and fears and tribulations and injustices and wrongs and all these junk. On the other side, we've got God's promises, right? We see his glory. We see the promise of his coming kingdom, his righteousness. We see the promises of Scripture that God works all things together for good to those who love him, who are called according to his purpose. His promises, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. His promises in his instructions, do not worry, I provide for the birds of the air. Won't I provide for you, O you of little faith? Jesus saying, behold, I come quickly. But we wait, and we look, and we wait, and we look, and we wonder. We don't know when that's going to happen or how. And we live in the middle of the story. So how do we live when we're in the middle of the story? When times are dark, I want to give you 3 realities to hold on to. First reality, God's permissive will. God's permissive will. He sometimes allows evil people to come to power. He sometimes allows evil people to succeed in their schemes. He sometimes allows evil people to succeed against God's people for a time and for a purpose. And there's mystery in this. And we wonder, we find ourselves asking, how could a just God let, fill in the blank, whatever it is, happen? We don't know. And God doesn't give us an answer. We do know that God is just and faithful. He will make things right. How this works together, you tell me. I don't know. But consider the Lord Jesus, God's own Son. And God allowed him, placed him in the hands of evil rulers who had him crucified on a Roman cross, impaled on a Roman cross. You think of Pilate speaking to Jesus. He said to Jesus, you're not going to speak to me, because Jesus had been quiet at his trial. And Pilate says, do you not know that I have authority over you to release you? I also have authority to crucify you. And Jesus spoke back to him, you would have no authority over me unless it had been given to you from above. That's faith in the God of glory. He has purpose. There was a purpose in Jesus' death. There was a purpose and a plan and a faithfulness in his resurrection and his exaltation to heaven and to glory. You look at political leaders in our world. Some are evil, just plain evil. You look at wrongs done at governmental positions. And then you look at the book of Daniel. And you see, God somehow brought Daniel to a position of influence right with the emperor, the king of Babylon. And through Daniel, he announced the succession of world empires, Babylon, then Medo-Persia, then Greece, then Rome, all the way to the future Antichrist that we believe is still coming. And each one is given authority for a time, and then the authority is taken back and given and taken back and given and taken back. And you're thinking, okay, even though the world looks as it does, God is calling the shots. He's in charge. The first thing that we hang on to is God's permissive will. Second reality, God's quiet providence. God's quiet and gracious providence. In the darkest times, God is always working for the good of his people. He's always working, and for his glory. God works quietly. As I said, he's never mentioned in the book of Esther, and yet he's working everywhere. And we're going to see next time the way all of these different threads come together. By the end of the book, you have to say he is the main character. And that's often how it is in life too. God works quietly. He works actively. Always according to his promises. He never rests. He never sleeps. Sometimes we catch little glimpses of his hand. You see that in this statement from Mordecai. Who knows whether you've come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Even in the darkest situations, sometimes there's a little glimpse that just maybe God is at work right now. Chance meetings, amazing provisions, precise timing. And you see enough of that and you say, I think God's at work. I don't know how. I don't know what he's going to do. but I can see it. Have you been there? Where you can see his hand at work? And you suspect that? Well, in the story of Esther, he's working to provide for his people before the need arises. I've seen in my own ministry situations like this where I think of one family where the man had been doing a lot of traveling with his job, and then all of a sudden he was changed in his responsibilities to where he was going to be working at the home office right in town and given a new position and thought, well, okay, I'll be closer to home, I guess, and okay, well, that's nice. I can spend time, at home more. And so all of a sudden he's here, and then their daughter gets diagnosed with cancer. And it's like, wow. It's like the Lord said, you need to be close. And he was able to provide and be a help. I've seen situations like that again and again where the Lord is preparing before the need arises. And it's even when we can't see it. And this story, again, is not just about Esther. It's not just about Mordecai. It's about all of the Jews all over the empire. For the ordinary Jew, thousands of miles from the capital, when the news comes, you're about to be exterminated 1 year. I mean, the wailing goes up. The grief goes up. They don't know what God is doing right in Susa, quietly. It looks hopeless. They can't do a thing. But God is sovereign, and he's good. Third reality, God-given opportunities to act in faith. God-given opportunities to act in faith. There are times when God calls his people to take wise and courageous action. That's where Esther is at this point. To take action. You see, the doctrine of God's sovereignty, and sometimes we can debate, the sovereignty of God and the responsibility of human beings. And some people say, if you press too hard on that doctrine of God's sovereignty, then it just turns us into puppets and we've got no motivation to act at all, No, actually, when you see the doctrine of God's sovereignty right, it motivates action. If you believe in a God who is sovereign and he is orchestrating the situations and he brings an opportunity before you, okay, God's led me to this. He wants me to act. And then you act in faith. It gives us confidence to act. And there's times when we are presented with unique opportunities. And you say, God has placed me in a unique place to do something. There's great personal risk if I do something. But I also believe God wants me to act. And I don't have any idea how he's going to act in this and how he's going to use this. But sometimes God leads us to a point where we have no choice. And that's where Esther is. I think of the Apostle Paul when he said, Philippians chapter 1, he was going to be held on trial and he was going to appear right before Emperor Nero, a maniac of an emperor, a Roman emperor. And he says, I don't know if this is going to result in my life or death. But he said, my prayer, my desire is that Christ will be honored in my body, whether by life or by death. Pray that I'll be faithful, that I'll speak and honor Christ and present him faithfully in that situation. And we don't know. And one of the great opportunities, even during times of persecution, is to speak for Christ. I'm thinking of Jesus' words in Luke 21, verse 12 and following, where Jesus says to his followers, and not just his immediate disciples, but I think his followers all down through the ages, the godless will lay their hands on you. They will persecute you. They will deliver you up to the synagogues and to prisons. Okay, in the first century, the unbelieving Jews were some of the major persecutors of Christians, but later on it became simply kings. But he said, you'll be brought before kings and governors for my name's sake. How do you respond? Jesus says, this will be your opportunity. Your opportunity when you're brought trial before these rulers. Settle it therefore in your minds not to meditate beforehand about how you're going to answer, because I will give you a mouth and I will give you wisdom, which none of your adversaries will be able to withstand or contradict. And that's exactly what we see happening in the book of Acts. Where are you this morning? Probably you can identify with a lot of this stuff, scratching your head, saying, boy, there's a lot of things that as I look at, even as I look at his church, I wish were different and things that need to be done. Okay, do we believe that God is faithful, that he's working in the details? There's no accidents. Do we look for opportunities? What does God want me to do? By faith, obedient faith, courageous faith. It could be in any form. I mean, it was suggested even in the morning prayer, a statement of apology, act of forgiveness, an act of confrontation of somebody, to speak boldly to them in love and in grace, realizing that we all fail. Whatever it may be. Maybe it's a situation in your family. Maybe it's a loved one. And you're asking for wisdom and you're looking. Whatever it may be. Seek God's face and say, is there something you want me to do? And believe in a sovereign God. That motivates hope. I want you to leave this morning with hope. God is faithful. He's active. Trust him and obey. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for the words that we've seen. A testimony of a faithful God who acts in even the seemingly coincidental things of life. And there are no accidents with you. So I pray for your people. I do pray that you would strengthen us, fill us with hope, motivate us to obey, and give us no choice if there's things that you have us to do. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.